morning and welcome to the Australian National Memorial. My name is Stephanie Branson. For the next couple of hours, it is my proud duty to be your host through to the commencement of the centenary service at 10:30 a.m. Today we pause to mark 100 years since the end of the Great War. Today we pause for the 100th time to remember over 60,000 Australians who never returned. Today we remember the countless more Australians whose lives were changed forever by war. It's a day created from a conflict that the world hoped never to see again. This morning, as we await the memorial service, we stand witness to a remarkable collective achievement, the transmission across generations of respect and remembrance for those who served and still serve today. In a few moments, we will commence our pre-service program. The repertoire will include music from the Royal Australian Air Force Band and our choir, the Voices of Birrelea. Readings from soldiers and officers from the Australian Defence Force, also including documentaries about the First World War and its end, followed finally with a tribute to those who served during the First World War with the Roll of Honour. First though, some housekeeping announcements. I'd like to let you know that the coffee and croissant tent is open. It looks like it's closed because of the wind. The front flaps are sealed, but please go in the side and coffee and croissants await you. Please, for those arriving, feel free to take a seat, or you're allowed to stand at the rear if you prefer. For those of you intending to lay a floral tribute during the public wreath-laying segment of the service, please ensure that you've registered the information tent on arrival. If you pre-registered prior to your arrival, you do not need to re-register. Public wreath-laying will be conducted towards the end of the service, and it will be managed in order of registration. Whilst the Master of Ceremonies will announce names and organisations, it may not be directly as each wreath is being laid due to the number of individuals and groups who are participating. For further information, please refer to the brochure that was provided to you on arrival. Performing for us this morning is the Royal Australian Air Force Band and vocalist Samantha Morley. They're joined by the Voices of Birrelea, a Brisbane-based youth choral organisation founded in 1995. They will be conducted by music directors Flight Lieutenant Daniel Phillips and Julie Christensen, OAM. Would you please make them very welcome?
Dear apparaît. La servante est jeune et gentille, les yeux ont comme un papillon, comme un sauvage son nez petit, nous l'appelons la Madelon. Nous en rêvons la nuit, nous imposer le jour, ce n'est que Madelon, aime-nous c'est l'amour, comme Madelon, rien ne servir à voir. Sous la tonnelle, le fond de son chiffon, et chacun lui raconte une histoire ensemble. wanted you. When the clouds roll by, I'll come to you. Then the skies will seem more blue down in Lover's Lane, my dearie. Wedding bells will ring so merrily. Every tear will be a memory. So wait and pray each night for me till we meet again. Then the skies will seem more blue down in Lover's Lane, my dearie. Wedding bells will ring so merrily. Every tear will be a memory. So wait and pray each night for me till we meet
God on high, hear my prayer. In my need, you have always been there. He is young, he's afraid. Let him rest, heaven blessed. Bring him home, bring him home, bring him home. He's like the son I might have known if God had granted me a son. The summers die one by one, how soon they fly on and on. And I am old and will be gone.
Please thank the Royal Australian Air Force Band and the voices of Burralee. They will be performing for us again later on this morning. Australia's involvement in the First World War began when Britain and Germany went to war on the 4th of August 1914, and both Prime Minister Joseph Cook and opposition leader Andrew Fisher, who were in the midst of an election campaign, pledged full support for Britain. The outbreak of war was greeted in Australia, as in many other places, with great enthusiasm. In most cases, the story for departure was familiar, with the ship's final whistle, family pressed against iron railings, hoping to catch one last glimpse of their loved ones. Many watched with mingled pride and heartbreak as the ship carried away husbands, sons, sweethearts, and fathers, perhaps forever, to fight for king and country. While thousands rushed to volunteer, most of the men accepted into the Australian Imperial Force in August 1914 were first sent to Egypt, not Europe, to meet the threat which a new belligerent, the Ottoman Empire, posed to British interests in the Middle East and the Suez Canal. The first significant Australian action of the war was the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Forces landing on Rabaul on the 11th of September in 1914. The Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force took possession of German New Guinea at Tomar on the 17th of September 1914, and also of the neighbouring islands of the Bismarck Archipelago in October 1914. On the 9th of November in 1914, the Royal Australian Navy made a major contribution when HMAS Sydney destroyed the German raider SMS Emden. After 4.5 months of training near Cairo, the Australians departed by ship for the Gallipoli Peninsula, along with troops from New Zealand, Britain, and France. This morning, you'll be taken on a journey from enlistment to the Armistice through a series of excerpts and first-hand accounts from the First World War. Many of the extracts you'll see this morning are drawn from a documentary created by the Commonwealth Film Unit in 1965, marking 50 years since the landings at Gallipoli. A century after the armistice that ended the war, the men and women who served are lost to us. But this morning, we bring you their story.
It used to be called the Great War because it was thought man had won everlasting peace, and memorials and monuments to it were built all over the world. We see it today as the last of the soldiers' wars, in which men were more important than machinery. But half a century ago, those who fought believed it was the war to end all wars. "61,000 names are here, the first Australians to die in a European war. Only for them was the peace everlasting." The names of many of those who survived it are to be found in the files of the Repatriation Department. The facts are here: name, age, record of service, medical history. But the forms don't tell you what went on inside a man's mind. You can't turn a page and find out what it's like to have your youth drained away in battle. It starts in far-off Sarajevo, when a young student assassinates the Habsburg heir. But within 4 days, it has taken drought and elections from the local headlines. Recruiting calls from past wars are taken out and repolished, and promises are made to stand behind the mother country, to help her and defend her to our last man and our last shilling. By the 2nd of August 1914, Australia has undertaken to supply 20,000 men. Within weeks, cattlemen become cavalry. Horses and men bred for the grasslands of the outback are taught new skills in preparation for service in a very different landscape. It will all be over by Christmas, say the newspapers. They'll never leave Australia's shores. But the training continues, harder than ever. The urgency is not that of crisis. With the last major conflict 100 years in the past, these raw soldiers are able to believe in the glory of war. They talk about the hero's death, in which there is no suffering, only the splendid sacrifice for a noble cause. So, in the beginning, the goodbyes are for men with stout hearts. It is as well they will need them. For although in 1914 Australia is a young nation, its casualties over the next 4 years will exceed 250,000. Later, they will leave under cover of darkness, and a voyage will be a dangerous exercise. But in the beginning, it's just like an ocean cruise, a grand occasion. And then, with the first sight of foreign lands, the adventure begins.
The morning broke dull and stormy, and we formed up in the parade ground, in readiness to march off. Before we reached the wharves, a pretty big bunch of people had collected, and we had a job to get through them. They gave us all sorts of things, and there were a few tearful scenes. By the time the last of the men were on board, the streets and botanic gardens were alive with people, in spite of the rain. But they were too late, and there were many a chap on the boat who they would never see again, and who no doubt was taking a last look at old Sydney and wondering when we'd see it again. As we passed down the harbour, we could hear the cheers floating across the water to us, and all the boats in the harbour set their sirens going for all they were worth. We could see the people still waving as we disappeared round the heads. Everyone was straining their eyes to get a last look at Sydney. The rigging was full of men who waved to the last. Archie Barwick, 1st Battalion, 18th of October 1914.
Men were lying killed and mutilated in heaps, with large blackened flesh wounds. One man had a horizontal section of the head taken off, exposing mangled brain tissue. The ship was riddled with gaping holes, and it was with difficulty one could walk about the decks, and she was gutted with fire. Some of the men who were brought off to the Sydney presented horrible sights, and by this time the wounds were all practically foul and stinking. Maggots 1/4 inch long were crawling over them, only 24 to 30 hours after injury. Practically nothing had been done to the wounded sailors, and they were all roughly attended by a party and dispatched to us as quickly as possible. A cook's mate named Fulton did some exceedingly disagreeable work, with great credit to himself in connection with this. Dr. H.S. Ollerhead, on the occasion of the destruction of the German raider Emden by the crew of HMAS Sydney, November 1914.
Dear Father, I have made up my mind to enlist. I'm beginning to enjoy my work as I've never enjoyed it before. However, I think that if I did not go now, I shall always regret it. Those things that hurt most are not the laying aside of a promising course or of a life which I enjoy very much, but the sorrow which I know I shall cause both mother and you. What comes home to me is that I am abiding here in comfort, while others, perhaps having people dependent on them, are fighting my battles and giving their lives for me. You must not think that I'm making a hasty decision. The decision has been arrived at after long hours of meditation. Owen Lewis, 3 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps, 27th of April 1915, killed in action, 12th of April 1918.
Well, the more I see of this place, the less I like it. The heat and the sand are the worst points about it, and the training is a lot worse than in Australia. We start at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we never finish until 10 o'clock at night. That is the time we're supposed to finish, but last night it was 12 o'clock. We are working in sand up to our boot tops. This is very heavy training, and any men who are not in the best of health cannot stand it. Frank Charlie Ash, 11th Battalion.
It has been decided to seize the narrow neck of land that guards the Dardanelles Straits, the Hellespont of the ancient world. The prize is the pathway to the Black Sea and the Russian allies, the opposition, a supposedly impotent enemy. The operation has been planned 4 months ahead, But by April, the well-informed Turks outnumber the attackers by 2 to 1. Things go wrong from the start. The Turks hold unassailable cliff-top positions. Plans go awry, communications are unreliable. The advance is uneven. Within months, this rugged no man's land will become the center for recriminations, accusations, and postmortems. And while politicians in London argue about what went wrong, at Gallipoli, romanticism dies in a fly-blown hole in the ground. Forever after, those who live through it will know that wars cost blood, pride, and human decency. Memory has sterilized history. Gone is the stench of stale blood and human refuse, and forgotten the other enemy, disease. Many escape Turkish steel, only to fall victim to the ravages of dysentery and typhoid. In December, the High Command admits failure and orders the evacuation of the peninsula.
The next hour provided an experience never to be forgotten. The rappings and scrapings on the hull of the boat by mooring wires of the mine seemed never-ending. On 2 occasions, something much harder than wires hit the bow of the boat and rattled away astern. And once some object seemed to catch up forward and remain knocking for several minutes before it broke away and rattled astern. Charles Suckling, HMAS AE2, 1915.
The suspense is nerve-wracking. All we can do is follow the pinnace towing us about. The thought comes to me that perhaps we are the unfortunate ones to be sacrificed in drawing the enemy's fire. Such a cheerful thought. Oh, why the dickens don't they fire at us? There are a couple of lights flashing about. They must have seen us. Crack, swish, ping. At last we breathe a sigh of relief. The suspense is over. Some get ashore safely. Some are hit slightly, others are drowned in only a couple of feet of water because, in the excitement, no one notices their plight. One fellow remains in the boat after all the others have disembarked. He looks at us dazedly, leaning forward on his rifle. A sailor touches him on the arm, and the soldier falls forward into the bottom of the boat, dead. William Turnley, 25th of April 1915, 1st Field Company Engineers.
We were receiving wounded all night, and terrible wounds they were. The majority of them were 10 days old, fly-blown and septic. All were operated upon on admission, and the little theatre was kept busy all night. Limbs, which had they been able to have been treated before would have been saved, had to be amputated. Ilma Gertrude Lavelle, Number 3, Australian General Hospital, Lemnos.
The country was precipitous, the heat tropical, and way down with our kit, the pace was a killer. At every pause of breath, a frantic staff officer would urge the men on. Don't pause. If only 20 reach the summit, push on. 12 out of the 100 men reached the summit, and a sweet reception awaited. Shrapnel tore us from the flank. Machine guns rapped out their impatient note from the front and flank, and rifles bounced us from all sides. Men were dropping all around. Our nerves were on edge from the rain of shells and the rifle fire. A shrapnel shell pumped itself into our dugout, fortunately forgetting to burst. 10 seconds later, another hurtled through the air, just missing the head of the man at the nearest end of the trench next to me. The next shell wounded the 2 men next beyond and killed the 3rd, and the next killed the 2 men next to them. All this in about 30 seconds. Is it any wonder our hearts beat like steam hammers? Men live a lifetime in such a half minute. Hubert Meyer, 3rd Battalion, killed in action 6th of August 1915.
The chance of a death wound at any moment is the only drawback to our life. Sleep is patchy, for our hours are irregular, and we doss in dugouts in the sides of the trenches. The food is very wholesome. I never dreamt I could relish bully beef, cheese, onions, jam and solid biscuits so much. Now and again we have an issue of bread, which is a luxury. For smoking, we receive each week 4 packets of cigarettes or tobacco and a box of matches. Our toilet is not so elaborate. We get a wash when we go down for a swim at the beach, about 1.25 miles down the gully once a week. It's great. Brushing our teeth is out of the question, for we have to conserve the water. The same applies to shaving. Things are not always as bad as that, but the life is certainly too hard for a weakling. Archibald Redhead, 23rd Battalion, 1915, killed in action 6th of May, 1917.
The war in the northern desert is a very different affair from Gallipoli, but it too is the kind of which legends are made. General Harry Chevelle is part of the legend. He understands desert warfare and guides his men through one of Australia's most decisive and conclusive campaigns in the war. The armies that met at Gallipoli face each other again, this time on level ground. The tables are turned, the Turks defeated, but it takes 3 years of hard and bitter fighting. "40,000 prisoners of war are taken in this campaign. 40,000 defeated men, shuffling in a private no man's land, the debris of success." The victors enter Beersheba, and the wounded follow. Cachalots carry them, victor and vanquished, away from the sands of war. If you're not dead when they put you in, you will be by the time they take you out. The reward of victory in this arid world is water, and when the day is won, the wells flow over. In the quiet after the battle, the medical corps does its best to repair damaged bodies. For the prisoners, there is the added pain of defeat. After the campaign come floods and disease. There is no sweetness in tomorrow. This is one of the lessons of war. After Gallipoli, the desert, and after the desert, the fields of France. This will be the cruelest lesson of them all.
The days mostly are very hot. Our time is taken up with outpost duty and making long raids into the Turkish country. Most of our marching is done at night. Getting water for our horses is the worst thing we have to contend with. One of the horses I ride is really wonderful. He never seems to get tired and hangs on without a drink in an amazing manner. Perhaps he has been 60 miles and carried me, pack and all, right through. Most of the places we go to on the desert are very heavy going, through loose sand. In crossing over the sand dunes, our horses go right down to their knees and sometimes deeper. These places are blown up by the wind and the sides are very steep, often quite impossible to ride over. A horse here has no chance with a man mounting. Most of us would give a good deal to get a shift somewhere else for a change, as the desert gets very monotonous. Harold Suter, 7th Light Horse Regiment, 11th of July, 1916.
The Turks attacked our position in full force. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the fun began, with heavy artillery. Shrapnel started to burst everywhere. The Australians were given the job of being the first shock of the conflict. It was wonderful to watch the fight developing. First, the artillery making a terrific noise, presently to be intermingled with machine gun and rifle fire, which made an incessant rattle. Enemy aeroplanes came right over us and dropped bombs and darts and turned their machine gun fire on us. It was hell for a while for a few of us. Some horses were killed, and a few men were killed or wounded. After the bombs were finished, we were subjected to shrapnel and high explosives. After 4.5 hours of solid fighting, our chaps were relieved. It was during the retirement that most of our casualties occurred, for they had to ride through a perfect hail of lead. Charles McGrath, 1st Light Horse Regiment, August 1916.
The day before the fight, he was laughing and joking as usual and was full of spirit all through the long night ride. He rode into action just behind me, and the last I saw of him, he was standing in his stirrups and cheering. He was hit in the head and the chest. I helped him under the cover of his horse, which was killed. I held the poor boy's hands while he passed away. He only lived about 10 minutes after he was wounded and did not feel any pain, thank God. Edward Ralston and John Bailey, 12th Light Horse Regiment.
The air is pungent with the smell of cordite, filled with the staccato chatter of the Vickers, Lewis and Spandau. Half rolling, diving, zooming, stalling, split-slipping, by inches you miss collision with friend or foe. Stuttering streams of lead with only tracer bullets or a crackle or a smack in your wings or fuselage to apprise you of where the enemy fire is going or has gone. A false flashes by and down with a Bristol on his tail. Bullets thud into the tail of the Hun. He zooms and turns in an endeavour to shake the Bristol off his tail, in vain. There is a wilder, more violent noise. The Hun machine is hurtling earthwards, not diving or spinning, not trying to evade its pursuer, hurtling to its finish. Leslie Sutherland, No. 1 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps.
Thank you, Leading Aircraftman Lipscomb. Returning now are the Royal Australian Air Force Band and Voices of Birrelly Choir. Once again, they will be led by music directors, Flight Lieutenant Daniel Phillips and Julie Christensen, OAM.
be realized. If the thundercloud passes rain, so let it rain, rain down on him.
yet turning, turning stay. Remember me when no more day by day you tell me of our future that you planned. Only remember me. You understand it will be late to counsel them or pray. Yet if you should forget me for a while, and afterward remember, do not grieve. For if the darkness and corruption leave a vestige of the thoughts that once I had, better by far you should forget and smile than that you should remember, than that you should remember and be sad. After your wounds have healed, after those crosses been planted in all those fields, after that long boat ride on the way across the sea, and after this train carries thee, I will love you after the war. I love you always and forevermore. I will love you after the war, forever, for always and more. After my boots dried and the tobacco's all but gone, along with the postcards I've carried under my arm, after I remember all the words I couldn't say, and after this long night fades away, After this blackbird lifts up from off your chest, and after your soul takes its final rest, my love, please forgive me. I never planned to die, and love lace 2 pennies for my heart. I will love you after the war. I love you always and forevermore. Oh, I will love you
Please thank the Royal Australian Air Force Band and the voices of Birrelleen. For our visitors who are just arriving, please take your seats as soon as possible, and your cooperation in filling the empty seats will ensure that everyone can be accommodated. Public wreath-laying will be conducted towards the end of the service. It will be managed in order of registration. And whilst the Master of Ceremonies will announce names and organisations, it may not be directly, as each wreath is being laid due to the number of individuals and groups participating. For further information, please refer to the brochure that was provided to you at registration. At the conclusion of the service, please remain seated until the official party have moved from the memorial area directly in front of me and have departed along the exit path. Once the official party has departed, please feel free to either remain in your seat or move forward to view the memorial. You will be advised when you can leave the site to make your way down to the promenade, where your coaches and your shuttles will be located. The centenary service is now just under 1 hour away. It's time now to commence your preparations. It's important that you are positioned and settled in your seats by 10 a.m. for the final segment of our pre-service program. Please allow ample time for visiting the toilets, and please remember to ensure that your mobile phone is turned off. I would like now to broadly acknowledge the first VIP party that has joined us already this morning: ambassadors, presidents, local mayors and Defence Force members who join us at this special place on the Western Front to remember all those who served here 100 years ago.
It's probably a silly reason. It wasn't for king and country. Australia's too big to be carted away by anybody, and I wasn't concerned about that. What I really was worried about was the women and the children. If the place was invaded, you know, the war had been going long enough for us to hear what was happening to some of the women and children, and villages in France being bombed out and so forth. So that was my main concern, really, to see if I could do a little bit to protect them. And the same reason I volunteered for the Second War. I was 5.5 years in that too.
It was about 5 miles from the front, Steenwijk, the Hoopling sector, which was a kind of a training ground for both sides of trench warfare. The trenches were dry and well established on both sides. There was never any serious fighting there, but it was, as I say, a training ground. I well remember there's one spot there. The Germans were very methodical. There's one place there, they used to go right on the dot in a half hour. They used to fire off about 50 rounds of machine gun. You just wait in the post until you hear these 50 posts. You could walk across. Quite safe. But that was the first casualty I saw there was a chap named Purdy, who was a champion chess player for New South Wales, 6'1" tall. He was a fatalist. You know, if I'm going to be killed, they'd be killed. He was. He wouldn't duck in the trenches. He got a sniper's bullet right through the head. That was the first casualty I saw. He was killed outright. But except for snipers, there was no activity. Occasionally they'd shell land over a shell or two, but wasn't any serious fighting.
When I went in the trenches and when I went to bed, I went to sleep. You could have a shell burst within 10 yards of me, I wouldn't hear it. But if you just said, Mac, soft like that, I was awake instantly. You got used to the shells bursting, it's just part of the night noises. But you just had to mention my name, soft voice, I was awake instantly. Of course, if there was a raid coming over or anything like that, the Germans, well, you had to get out and stand too, be ready.
and you'd know exactly what second you had to leap out of the trench and go forward. The closer you could keep to your barrage, the safer you were. But it didn't give the Germans time to realise that you were coming, and you was on top of them before they knew where they were.
There's one thing getting killed with a machine gun bullet, and another thing getting a shell bursting and blasting you bits and pieces of you going in all directions. I had 3 mates live just up about half a mile from where my farm up in Castor Road. 3 young boys. They went away to the war and they were in our battalion. We were in Armistice too, and they came out of the trench and got in a shell hole to have a bit of dinner. And one of these minenwerfers landed in the hole with them. 2 sandbags about that long and about that wide had bagged up the 3 of them. Those are the kind of things you don't want to remember or dream about. Because that's another thing where the authorities, I think, made a mistake. They shouldn't have allowed brothers to be together. They should have had one in one battalion, one in another one, and so on. So they don't all get killed at once.
Going back out, and another fellow with me, we got back to where the barrage was pretty thick, the German barrage, and we stopped. And the big shell came over, landed just outside the trench and blew the whole damn lot over the top of us, buried us. Some fellas just close to us, they knew we were there, and they come to see how we fared when this big one burst. And they found we were buried, they dug us out.
Just stepped outside and there's 2 officers, Captain Tyrrell was standing like where you are there, and a lieutenant beside him there. A nice sunny morning, about 10 o'clock, and a shell came over, a 4.2 German howitzer shell, and it landed about that far behind Captain Tyrrell. Fortunately for me, he was dead in line between the bursting shell and myself. He got his back all torn out with the metal from the shell burst. I didn't get a scratch. He protected me. He fell over into my arm, as a matter of fact. Colonel Lord, he was a colonel at the time. He was only about 20 yards away, walking over to talk to him. He got a bit of shell through his sleeve of his jacket. That, I thought to myself, well, I'm not going to get hurt in this war. You know, if that captain had been standing a foot that way or a foot that way, I'd have got in my chest what he got in his back. So he saved my life there. Captain Tyrrell, that was. I'll never forget the man for that. I never had any fear about getting hurt after that.
I can't say I'm emotional at all, because we're living with death all the time, don't forget. That question was asked me about one of my coppers got killed. The leg was just outside my dugout with a really big shell that fell and got him and killed him, and the sergeant didn't get a scrape of the same shell. The girl was asking the question, what emotion? I didn't have any. And I said, oh, I thought to myself, why is that? Why didn't I have any bloody emotion? The poor bastard's dead. I did not have any emotion. He was the bloke I just relieved on the tic-tac business. I didn't have any emotion. And I said to myself, bugger, it might have been me a couple of hours later. Could have been me. And the sergeant too. But I didn't have any emotion whatsoever. When I heard about my brother getting killed, no emotion either. I might be different, I don't know.
I think one of the worst gases they ever used, because it cut the lungs out of them. If you've got a belly full of chlorine gas, you spat your lungs out. Oh, fellas there, it took them days and days to die, but die they would from chlorine. The only thing that was in favour of the phosgene against chlorine was chlorine, you could see it. See, the chlorine gas came as a vapour cloud that you could see. It was like a fog.
But actually, I spoke to a few German prisoners, which we took at various times, and I met quite some nice fellows among them. They'd been waiters and whatnot in London and spoke English very well. I found them quite decent fellows, except when there was the back of a gun and it was pointing my way, then they were not my friends then. I just take it as something that they had to do. I mean, you couldn't walk out. You had to do your job, and you did it for 6 or 8 hours a shift, and then you'd go to bed and have a sleep. I think I never heard a squeak from any of the boys. I used to go round them practically every day. I went through the companies to check the telephone lines and that, see that everything was all right. No, I reckon we had about the best battalion in the whole war on either side of no man's land. The 40th, you couldn't beat them. Nothing would stop them once they had a go at something, they took it. We never lost a battle, we never had a retreat. We were coming down a slope like that, and we met the French people coming out of this Méricourt. They had their little hand wagon things with something like a cart, you know, and they had their bit of furniture and their bedding and whatnot on it. Poor old people they were, and tears running down their cheeks, the old ladies. And I said, the Germans are coming, they're just over the hill there. And that's why they were getting out, of course, before the Germans came in. Well, we let them pass us, and then we went down and we met the Germans in the middle of Méricourt. And I tell you, we didn't give them any quarter either. About an hour and they were out of there, what was still left of them.
March 1918, the Germans broke through the Somme. We had just been issued the Trumpets Fund. The bloody panic bells had rang. Full dress, 6 o'clock, whatever time it was, you see. Full dress, marching order, 6 o'clock. Marching order means the whole bloody box of knives. All these damn tins of chocolates and leave the damn thing behind. We took what we could, of course, and the other what we couldn't take. Socks and all that type of thing, and bars of chocolate and tins of coffee and milk mixed up together. None of them had to be left behind. That broke my heart, and all the other broke hearts too. Marching order means you got to front it quick and loud.
We were not afraid that they wouldn't come back. I can remember my mother made a big batch of plum jam, and she put it into a big stone jar and sealed it up, and she said that not to be opened until the boys came home. And it wasn't opened until the boys came home, and it was beautiful jam, lovely. But that's the faith that she had.
I've seen the times when I've gone without food for days and days and fighting furiously all the time. Those days will live in my memory forever. In the awfulness of that living hell in France and Flanders, one can't believe that there is a God in the world with us. My best of pals gone under and buried by my own hands without even a clergyman to read the last rites. Only a rough wooden cross to betray his remains in the shell-torn blood-red fields of France. One can't go through this awful war without a feeling of disgust. I've killed boys in the ranks of the Hun, just like myself, and after it's all over, I feel sorry. One can't help it. One gets so awfully callous, you know. When I buried poor little Bluey Taylor in Ypres, I cried for 2 hours on his grave. It broke me up as nothing has done so before. He was my best pal, and now he's gone. As I look at the photo of his grave, a cold, bleak grave in Flanders, I feel that wretched I could almost kill my miserable self. And to think it's all for nothing. Letter to Joe Cox of Mount Peter Station, Wagga Wagga, from Jack, number 4, Convalescent Home, Wiltshire, 17th of April 1918.
All of us bent low as the shells came faster and more furious. It was awful. My heart thumped with fear and my face must have been white. I turned my head and blew the whistle, gave a shout of "Forward!" Wait a moment to steel my nerves, and then swinging my revolver around my head, I dashed out. The shells were bursting everywhere and I heard the bullets smacking the ground about me. Oh God, help me. Oh, keep me. I forced my way through the wire. What a scene of fury, horror and war. Dead and wounded all over the place. Blood and debris. Bullets spat and I know a machine gun was after me. God help me, keep me, I prayed as I rushed, when suddenly, splash! I was up to my chest in muddy water in a hollow. Dead men and wounded lay about the ditch in all directions, an awful scene of awful war. John Gotch Ridley, 53rd Battalion.
A salvo of shells landed near. I glanced up to try and locate the burst by the flying mud when I noticed that the whole side of the shell slit was falling in. It struck me in the act of rising and completely buried me. The weight on my tin hat pressed me down irresistibly and forced my chin into my chest. After struggling a little, I found that it only settled the earth closer around me. The brim of my hat kept the earth out of my nose, but the weight gradually forced it further down on my head, the headband gradually travelling down my nose and taking the skin with it. Then the realisation came of what was gradually but surely ending things. The soft earth at first yielded slightly to my struggles, but was slowly settling down and compressing under the weight above, so that the movement of my ribs was becoming more and more constricted. It was as though an iron band were tightening around my chest and preventing any movement. Then I heard the Sergeant Major speaking and calling me, as though he were a long way off. I heard him say, "Good God, I believe the man's buried. Come here, 2 men with shovels. Now gently, don't maim him." At last the terrible weight was relieved, and they lifted me out and laid me on the floor of the trench. Ronald McInnes, 53rd Battalion, November 1916.
Good God, it was terrible. Dead Australians lying about. We had to pick our way over them to reach our wounded men who signalled to us. In some places, the dead piled up 4 and 5 deep. The trench was almost battered down by shrapnel. The trip back to the dressing station was very severe. The saps were much narrower than I expected them to be. In some places, there was scarcely room for a stretcher to pass. It took us fully 2 hours to carry the poor chap to the aid post. It was a terrible experience. My whole body was trembling. Of course, on going down the second time, I was much more at ease, although very tired. 3 times to the firing line, and the rest of the time I carried wounded from the dressing stations to the motors. Towards evening, my legs were all trembling. The strain had been very severe. Every one of our men looked worn out. It must have been hell in the trenches. This war is not human. The sights I saw will never be forgotten. Langford Collie Priest, 8th Field Ambulance.
When we switched on our torches, we found the floor was literally covered with a mass of wounded men. Men being sick, moaning in pain or crying out for a drink, pleading to remove their boots, which in some cases had not been off their feet for over a week. We set to work lifting the stretchers, searching for cases of hemorrhage while the wounded held the torches to guide us. When our backs refused to hold us up any longer, we sat on the floor and cut the boots and socks off the stone-cold and swollen feet, wrapping them in cotton wool and bandages. While I attended one poor boy who had begun to hemorrhage, the next patient, sitting up, commenced coughing and spluttering. I turned my torch on him, revealing a German bleeding profusely from a horribly shattered lower jaw. Both men were immediately carried out into the rain again for the operating table. May Tilton, number 3 Australian Casualty Clearing Station, Popperinga, Belgium, 4th of October 1917.
The German batteries commenced firing, and we had 5 shells into us in quick succession, killing about 75 men outright and wounding many. For 18 hours, the men worked and watched like Trojans without food, and then came the shells. One killed around 40 men outright, another about 20. 10 died on the trip back and 102 were wounded. The upper deck electrical wires were shot away, so we were in darkness trying to get out the dead and wounded all night. There was only one doctor till 5 a.m. when we met a ship and another one with an assistant came on board. Shells had gone clean through the deck to explode among the Marines and the makeshift sick bay. Lieutenant William Henry Vaughan Edgar, HMAS Australia, on board the British ship HMS Iris, April 1918.
Before anyone could thoroughly realise what was happening, a huge leaping ball of fire was hurtling some thousands of feet to the earth. It is a sickening sight to see one of your mates going down in a hell of flames and have to sit by and not be able to render the least assistance. We went back to the aerodrome when the patrol was finished, feeling very sick at heart. We knew there would be a vacant place in the mess that night and that the next day's cables would strike deep and remorselessly at the hearts of loving ones at home. Roy King, Number 4 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps.
At 6:50 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, the message goes out. Hostilities will cease at 1100 hours today. Troops will stand fast on the line reached at that hour. The machine that has run so mercilessly for 4 years is at last brought to a stop. Now begins the task of rebuilding, mending, repairing. The scarred buildings can be rebuilt. The war-torn fields can be sown again. But the men, they can never be made the same. Those who survive look on the last march and the last touch of gunmetal as acts of finality. They believe the war to end all wars has been won. They believe the prize is worth the price. They are going home to a golden peace, to a promised land fit for heroes. How could they know it would all begin again in the short space of 2 decades? The names of many of those who survived it are to be found in the files of the Repatriation Department. The facts are there: name, age, record of service, medical history. But for the young men and women who serve the veterans today, the facts are not enough. They must know about the war, must translate the facts, and understand what each man went through. They have lived through 2 wars and a depression. They are the remnants of an army which time and history have reduced to a mere handful. The war they fought involved the peoples of every continent, caused great empires to collapse, and was more terrible than anything then known to man. They are old now, and an old man recalls the good times and veils the suffering with sentiment. Let them forget, as long as others will remember their deeds for them.
A fellow put his head into our barn. He yelled out to us, "The armistice has been signed." I don't think anyone believed him. I went to the battalion orderly room. On the notice board by the door was pinned a broad piece of paper. On it was typewritten in capital letters, "Hostilities will cease at 11 a.m. today." The date at the top was the 11th. I read it over and over. I walked off. I came back to see if it was still there. It was. I should have felt happy, but I did not. It was over, but so much had gone from life. The dreadfulness of it all seemed to overwhelm everything else. I thought of Ray and Billy, of Harold, my cousins, and I thought of all the grand fellows I had known, the friends I had made who would not be coming home with me. I went off by myself. I walked for miles. However could I adjust myself to the new world which was opening for me? Bert Bishop, 55th Battalion.
A monster snowball was assembled on a bank of the road, the makers intending to let her go on the approach of the first army car which came along. The car plunged straight into it. The applause was exhilarating. For the rest of the day, one was not safe anywhere within range until they played themselves out. Snowballs came from all angles with unerring aim, and some of them were hard, pure lumps of ice. They all had the time of their lives, sleeping the sleep of the just when they settled down that night. Richard Roberts, 3rd Battalion.
The public of London, which will look on the Australians' farewell march through the city today, has always had a warm corner in its heart for Dominion troops, and the Australians want no recommendation to them, least of all on Anzac Day. Their march today, the anniversary of the day which brought their fame all over the world, is in the nature of a farewell by the men of the Australian Imperial Force to the people of the old country. Not many of the men who will be seen on today's march took part in the landing on Gallipoli on the first Anzac Day. The gallant remnant which has survived to the end of the war is not a large body. This farewell march commemorates them and represents the splendid volunteer citizen army which grew out of that first Australian Expeditionary Force. This country is blighted to the Australians, as it is to all ranks of the British Army. Here they have spent their leave from France, and throughout the length and breadth of these islands are houses great and small, where families have voluntarily thrown open their doors to welcome Australian soldiers as guests. The Australian Imperial Force is homeward bound. Official program, Farewell March of the Australian Troops, London, 25th of April 1919.
4.5 years after I left Australia, I again stood by the rail of a transport steaming out of Plymouth with men who were strangers to me. Along the bulwarks of the great grey battleship stood the sailors who had kept the seaways of the world. Cheer upon cheer roared from them to us who sped their brothers in arms. Cheer upon cheer answered we to our comrades. I stood watching as night closed over the coasts of England. Against the grey mists of distance showed well-remembered faces in an endless gallery. Those who marched beside us a while and died that our peoples might live. Slowly, very slowly, night and distance closed over the English shores. Our ship lurched towards the southern seas. George Mitchell, 48th Battalion.
Thank you, Leading Seaman Rennie. The commemorative service today is a solemn and respectful ceremony, and the usual courtesies are expected. During the service, you will be asked at times to stand. If you are unable to do so, please remain seated. There are occasions when you'll be asked to stand include the last post, 1 minute of silence, Rouse, and the national anthems. It will be appropriate on these same occasions for gentlemen wearing hats to remove their headwear. Please respect our national flag and the flag of our host nation, France, flying here today. After the commemorative service is concluded, please remain in your places until the departure of the official party. At this time, you'll be advised of the arrangements for viewing the memorial wall and the floral tributes, and the procedure for departing the Australian National Memorial in a safe and timely manner. Throughout the service, we ask you to remain in place and be silent, to reflect on what occurred during the First World War over 100 years ago. Our official party will arrive shortly. Directly after their arrival, we will honour but just a few of our fallen soldiers, in particular those who have no known grave from 1915 to 1918.
is free.
Ladies and gentlemen, please now take your seats. Mesdames et messieurs, asseyez-vous s'il vous plaît.